Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Centre. I am Ramachandra Guha, and we are here today to celebrate the life and legacy of an extraordinary Indian, Keshav Desiraju, who died last month at the relatively early age of 66. Keshav was many things. He was an exemplary civil servant who worked in some of the most important areas of our social and public life, such as environment, education, and particularly health. Although he came from South India, he dug deep roots in his adopted state of Uttarakhand. He was a person of conspicuous integrity and courage, but he also had a playful sense of humor and mischievous wit. Many interests outside his work. He was a considerable scholar of music. And all of this possibly explains why, after he died last month, there was such an extraordinary outpouring of tributes to him and his work from all kinds of people. And as someone who had known Keisha for 35 years, what was, of course, striking while reading those tributes for me was how much I learned about someone I thought was a close friend. So many aspects of Indian life that he touched, which many other people did not know about. And we are here today, a little over a month after he's gone, to provide a more reflective look at his life and legacy. We've got 6 outstanding speakers who all knew Keshav in different capacities. We'll cover through what they have to say. We'll cover the range of his interests, his work, his influence, his impact. You'll also see that the speakers are from different parts of India, in different professions, from different backgrounds. Some of them were much younger than him. A couple were his generation. One, whom I'm particularly happy is here today, Rana Bhatt, was much older than him, but yet a close friend and associate of Keshav. So we hope through this conversation and this series of presentations to give you a glimpse of the kind of extraordinary person Keshav Desiraju was. Before I introduce my first speaker, I want to say a little bit about Keshav's connections to Bangalore. Now, Keshav had connections to many cities and many states. In fact, while reflecting on why he was such an extraordinary civil servant, it struck me that apart from his intelligence, his vision, his compassion, his quality education, he was a graduate of both Cambridge and Harvard universities, his great facility with languages, his ability to connect with people of all social backgrounds, classes, generations, Keshav was also fortunate in having deep links with 7 different states of India. And let me enumerate those states Keshav knew well. His mother tongue was Telugu, and he identified with the Andhra country from where his ancestors came. But he also had strong roots in Mysore, where his father's family had lived for several generations. His mother's family, though Telugu speaking, like his father speaking, was based in Tamil Nadu in the city of Chennai, which he also knew very well. And he spoke excellent Tamil and adequate Kannada, along with flawless Telugu, which was his mother tongue. So here are these 3 states he knew extremely well. The 4th state he had a deep attachment to was Maharashtra, and particularly the great cosmopolitan city of Bombay, where he went to school at Cathedral and also took his first degree at Elphinstone College. And he had a great interest in Bombay. He loved walking the streets of the city, despite his extraordinary and deep knowledge of South Indian classical music. He also loved the Bombay film and popular music. So Maharashtra was the 4th state to which he was connected. Then in 1978, he got into the Indian Administrative Service, and he was allotted the Uttar Pradesh cadre. Now, for someone from South India via Mumbai, Uttar Pradesh would be a kind of culture shock, especially if your first posting is Azamgarh, which was actually his first posting as a subdivisional magistrate. But he adjusted with aplomb, and he came to speak fluent Hindi. I myself have heard him deliver judgments in a magistrate's court in Hindi, much better Hindi than mine, even though I grew up in Dehradun. So he became a resident, and you could say a servant of the state of Uttar Pradesh. But then in 2000, that state was bifurcated, and he chose to go to Uttarakhand, where he had already served and where he was to spend many years working particularly on health, environment, and education. He was incredibly attached to Uttarakhand. He was a great trekker. He went to many parts of the state, including high altitude pasture lands, which he helped save from the depredations of developers. He bought a home there, which he spent some time in retirement. So 6 different states he knew intimately. Now, and that is probably one clue as to why he was such an extraordinarily effective civil servant who left the kind of legacy that he has. So, as I said, in this conversation today, we'll be talking about these different aspects of his work, and we are very, very happy and privileged and grateful at the BIC to have 6 quite remarkable individuals to speak about Keshav and his work. We're going to begin with Akshay Mangala, who is one of those much younger than Keshav. I suspect he may even be the youngest person in this panel, and he may talk about how he first met Keshav. He was, I think, a doctoral student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, looking at governance issues in Uttarakhand when he first met Keshav. After his PhD at MIT, Akshay taught at the Harvard Business School for a few years before moving to Oxford, where he is an associate professor at the Associate Professor of International Business at the Syed Business School. His research seeks to understand why and how states govern effectively, provide essential public services, and promote inclusive development. His first book will be out soon from Cambridge University Press. It's called Making Bureaucracy Work, the State Education and Public Service Delivery in Rural India. So over to you, Akshay.
Thank you, Ram. And I really privileged to be here with such an illustrious group in honor of our great friend, Keshav Desiraju. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about Keshav from the perspective of an academic studying the Indian state. As we all know, I mean, Keshav brings us all here. He's impacted so many lives. He was a dear friend to so many of us and so many more people. So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is really celebrate Keshav, the public servant. And to that, I will also add Keshav, the social theorist. I think we're all familiar with Keshav's illustrious career in the IAS, his many contributions to public policy, especially health and education. And we're also aware that he's someone of incredible talents and scholarly depth. Less well known, perhaps, is that he also held a very rich and complex perspective of human behavior. And this perspective, I would submit, and along with his commitment to social justice, really informed his work. He was unwavering in his support for people and the flourishing of people. This was not only amongst his friends and acquaintances, but equally to those unknown to him. And so it was this commitment, I would say, that really motivated him and informed his interactions, both personally and professionally. A bit about how I met Keshav. So I was a graduate student, as Ram mentioned, at MIT, and this was back in 2008. I was meeting Keshav in his office in Dehradun at the Secretariat. He was actually the principal health secretary of Uttarakhand at the time. And I was just a mere grad student embarking on a doctoral thesis, interested in understanding how public services reach disadvantaged, underserved communities, particularly primary education. And the first thing I must say in my interaction with Keshav that stood out was that he treated me as an equal. And I don't want to, I cannot actually overstate this. This just happened immediately and without any effort. And it just may seem mundane to people and unworthy of mentioning. But for a student of the Indian state, this was actually a profound experience. The IAS, as we know, is the embodiment of bureaucracy of the Weberian state, with all of its commitments to hierarchical order, rules, procedures. And I have examined bureaucracy up close in India, mainly in the Hindi-speaking states like Uttarakhand, but also Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Delhi. I've also had multiple exchanges with public officials all throughout India, from Gujarat to Kerala. But I would say none of my interactions has anything come close to what I experienced with Keshav in just his treatment of other people. He didn't question hierarchy. He actually shattered it in his interpersonal relationships. And so I would say that in just our first few exchanges, I was taken aback by this Secretary of Health who was actually interested in my ideas, not imposing his ideas onto my research. Now, Keshav had actually been previously the education secretary in Uttarakhand, and I found myself taking copious notes anytime I would meet with him. I just wanted to learn so much from him. But he wanted to learn so much from me, from my field research, and he wasn't imposing his ideas. And he was eager that I learn, not by sitting in Dehradun, talking to him, but going out in the field, go and speak to teachers, speak to parents, speak to the local officials. This really mattered to him. I can't tell you how many senior bureaucrats I've met who think of the frontline street level bureaucrat, the teacher, the cop, the Anganwadi worker as just an extension of state corruption, as people who are not necessarily committed, who may not know. Keshav was not that bureaucrat. Keshav had immense trust in the front lines. And perhaps that's why he was willing to concede his own power and give it to people on the front line and mobilize them and motivate them and support them in their work. But with that also, evidence mattered a lot to Keshav. So in the 13 years in which I knew him, we had countless academic conversations about the political economy of the state and human development. And he was quite keen to integrate evidence and lessons from academic research into bureaucratic practices. And this was particularly the case in terms of policies that were affecting the least advantaged members of Indian society. So some of us may be familiar with the program. It's called the it's the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya program, the KGBV school program. Now, this is a residential school program initiated by the central government in the 1990s. And it provides remedial education for girls who are disadvantaged, who may have dropped out of school before completing the 8th grade. Now, Keshav was actually a champion of this program, which may not be as well known to people. But back when he was a district magistrate in Uttarkashi, he pressed the state government to extend that program beyond class 8 up to class 10. And it was this kind of pressure, quiet pressure from the background, that made it possible for girls to actually complete high school in that state. And so we had an exchange, and this was just a couple of days actually before he had passed away. And we were talking about this program and some of my research on it. And in the closing of his email to me, he had written, quote, "How much there is to do and how cruel our system is." And this is just evidence for how deeply concerned he was with the public administration system in India and how it treated those who were the least advantaged. Now, this unwavering concern that he had clearly informed his selection of projects. So he chose portfolios like health and education when they were seen as lower status within the IAS. So if you ask an IAS officer, what are the portfolios you want? Health and education weren't typically top of the list. They'd want the kind of powerful portfolios like finance and planning and so on. But Keshav was unencumbered by these conventions. He wanted to enter spaces where others didn't, and he wanted to look after the most vulnerable groups when he did so. And so that is perhaps why he was a driving force behind policies like India's Mental Health Act of 2017. And it is this kind of commitment that really allowed him to advance numerous other smaller programs that many of us would not even know about. Now, bureaucrats in a position like Keshav's, who are toiling away, working on issues like health and education, they have a lot of good reason to give up hope. If you look around you, you look at the lackluster investment and political commitment to many of these issues, it's very easy to become demotivated and fall into despair. But even as Keshav questioned and critiqued Indian bureaucracy, he was steadfastly committed to what it could accomplish. And he treated his position as a sacred duty to the public. And in many ways, he was just the quintessential bureaucrat. He always followed punctuality. He kept his paperwork tidy. He saw value in these administrative systems, but he didn't hold them above the citizen. He saw the citizen and her needs as coming first. And so he was also as willing to challenge red tape and stifling rules and make things easier, often by integrating civil society. And this is another key theme that I want to point out, is that much of the kind of Weberian notion of the state wants to treat the state as separate from society, a kind of closed system of power that's bound to its own rules. Keshav actually broke that kind of boundary and tried to incorporate non-governmental actors and supporting their work to get the best out of the private sector and non-state sector as well. So I just want to kind of wrap up my comments by saying, by referring to a quote actually by the Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein, who famously said, quote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Keshav's language knew no limits. As Ram mentioned actually just now in the introduction, he was well versed in Tamil, Hindi, English, Kannada, Telugu, other languages. But beyond the use of particular linguistic tongues, Wittgenstein's more general idea, I think, is that as soon as we speak, as soon as we write, as soon as we deploy words to order the world, we are in some ways theorizing about it, which means we're fundamentally engaging in a philosophical act. We're being philosophers by speaking, by writing. Keshav chose his words wisely. When he saw something beautiful, he would say so. If he thought something was grotesque, he would say that this is grotesque. And his interests were wide-ranging, and many of the other speakers today will talk about his other rich interests in politics, history, the arts, his love for Carnatic music. To me, these qualities reflect a mind that's really willing to submit itself to the humbling rag of knowledge. And it is here that I just want to flag that Keshav was a bureaucrat at the pinnacle of power, who saw power as a responsibility rather than as a means to an end. He saw it really as an end in itself that could help other people. So the richness of his life and all that it represented is available to us from his commitments to public welfare. He was extremely gentle. He had a mischievous smile we all can remember. And his acts, small and large, left mark on the Indian state. And to me, he really embodied an example for what public administration can be if it puts humanity first. And so with that, I just want to appreciate the memory of Keshav Desiraju, and hopefully we can all draw strength from the great purpose that he fought for in his life. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay. Our next speaker is Radha Bhatt, who is greatly admired and much loved Gandhian social worker in Uttarakhand. In fact, if I may say so, and I speak here not as a native of Uttarakhand, but I hope as a professional historian, the pre-eminent Sarvodaya worker of today. Radha Behan, aapka swagat hai. Radha Behan was born in 1932 in a remote part of Kumaon in a peasant family. At the age of 16, she joined the Lakshmi Ashram, which had recently been set up in near Kausani by a remarkable English woman who became a disciple of Gandhiji. She was originally called Catherine Mary Heilman. She took the name Sarla Behan. And in this very remote, feudal, patriarchal, economically backward part of India, she started a school for girls, imparting progressive education for girls. And Radha Behan was one of her first students. She worked in the Lakshmi Ashram in 1966. I believe it was. Sarla Behan did something very unusual for those who start NGOs and run them in India. She decided she needed a successor rather than die with the institution. And she wisely chose Radha Behan to run the Lakshmi Ashram, which she did for almost 20 years in her own right before giving it over to other people. Now, in this long tenure with the Lakshmi Ashram, Radha Behan was active in many social movements. The Chipko movement for the protection of peasant forest rights, the anti-alcohol movement against wife abuse by drunken men, a movement against open cast mining. In fact, my first memory of Radha Bain, which she probably has forgotten because I was then just a young student, but I cannot forget that, was in the year 1983, where she gave a talk in a village called Chandak Sikrana, near Pithoragarh, about the dangers, the environmental and social dangers of open cast mining. She has worked on water conservation, of course, on women's education. She has also been the head of some very important pan-Indian institutions, including the Gandhi Peace Foundation. And I had the great privilege of going to the Lakshmi Ashram in Kausani shortly before the pandemic. I think it was in April or May 2019. And I walked up the hill to see Radhaben. And 30 years before me, I walked up the hill just once, but 30 years before me, the district magistrate of Almora often walked up that hill to seek the counsel of Radhaben. Radhaben, would you please share your thoughts with us?
धन्यवाद राम भाई और सब लोग जो सुन रहे हैं. It might be difficult for someone listening my Hindi, but I certainly want to speak in Hindi. तो इसलिए मैं हिंदी में बोलूँगी और मुझे राम ने इजाज़त दी है, तो मैं सोचती हूँ कि आप लोग भी जरूर इसे समझ लेंगे, कोशिश करेंगे. केशव की बात इतनी ज्यादा है, मैं उन सबको आपके सामने नहीं रख सकती. समय की बात भी है और मौके की बात भी है. इट्स नॉट टाइम फॉर दैट. लेकिन मेरे पास और मेरे हृदय में उनके लिए बहुत है. सबसे बड़ी बात यह है कि उत्तराखंड में काम करने का जो निर्णय था, वो निर्णय केशव ने खुद से लिया और खुद तय किया कि मैं हिमालय क्षेत्र में जाऊंगा. मुझे ये लगता है कि एक स्पिरिचुअल बात भी थी हिमालय के क्षेत्र में आने की. एक अंदर कहीं से कभी एक आध बात में मुझे लगा था कि उनको हिमालय का क्षेत्र काम करने के लिए भी नहीं, साधना करने के लिए ज्यादा माफिक लगता था, ज्यादा अच्छा लगता था. लेकिन वो तो बात नहीं थी. वो एक जिला अधिकारी थे, डिस्ट्रिक्ट मजिस्ट्रेट थे और उसके हिसाब से उनको काम करना था. सबसे बड़ी बात है, कोई अधिकारी अपने लोगों को, जिन लोगों को का शासन करने के लिए वो आता है, उनको प्यार करने लगे. ये बहुत बड़ी बात है. और उसने सचमुच में, आप कहते हैं कि केशव ने उत्तराखंड को क्या दिया, मैं कहती हूँ उसने सबसे बड़ी चीज दी. उसने बहुत सारी अच्छी पॉलिसीज दी और बहुत सारे अच्छे प्रोग्राम्स दिए और बहुत सारे अच्छे काम किए. पर उन सबसे बड़ी बात है कि उसने उत्तराखंड के लोगों को प्यार दिया और उत्तराखंड के लोगों को ये महसूस हुआ कि केशव उनका अपना है. मुझे बहुत सारी ऐसी घटनाएं याद आती हैं, लेकिन एक दो घटनाएं तो इतनी ताजी हैं मेरे दिमाग में. मेरा दिमाग थोड़ा सा बहुत ताजा नहीं है अभी. मैं 89 शुरू करने वाली हूँ थोड़े दिनों में कुछ ही दिनों के बाद, तो इसलिए अभी इतना ताजा नहीं है, पर बहुत सारी चीजें हैं केशव की जो मुझे अभी भी याद हैं। केशव से एक बार मैं एक दो घटनाएं आपको बताऊंगी, दो स्मॉल छोटी स्टोरीज, और मैं सोचती हूँ कि उससे आप समझ सकेंगे कि वो किस तरह काम करते थे। ऐसे तो जो आईएएस लोग होते हैं उनको जो पुराने समय से सिखाया जाता है, अभी नहीं सिखाया जाता, लेकिन पुराने समय में सिखाया जाता था, खास करके ब्रिटिश रूल के समय में, कि आप पीपल से थोड़ा डिफरेंट रहिए, पीपल से थोड़ा अपने को अलग रखिए, देन यू कैन, तब आप उनको उन पर शासन कर सकते हैं। और अगर आप उनमें से उनके साथ हंसने मुस्कुराने लगेंगे तो नहीं कर सकेंगे। लेकिन मैं सोचती हूँ कि हंसने मुस्कुराने की ताकत उस गंभीर और अलग रहने की ताकत से, रौब दिखाने की ताकत से बहुत बड़ी ताकत है, और वो कैसे काम करती है वो भी मैं आपको बताऊंगी। तो केशव में वो ताकत थी, वो मुस्कुराहट थी, और वो प्यार था। तो वो हमारे लिए मिस्टर देशीराजू नहीं, केशव बन गए। हम उत्तराखंड वालों के लिए कोई व्यक्ति इतना निकट आ जाए, ये बहुत बड़ी बात है। तो एक बार की बात है, हम एक जगह पर कुछ काम करते थे, एक इलाके में, एक बहुत बड़े इलाके में, लगभग 80-100 कुछ इतनी बालवाड़ियां चलाते थे, महिलाओं के लिए काम करते थे। तो वहां एक महिला की बड़ी दिक्कत हो गई, उसके पति का देहांत हो गया, और उस महिला के जिस घर में वो रहती थी, जो पुराने समय से, जब से वो शादी करके आई उस घर में रही थी, वो घर उसके पास पड़ोस के किसी व्यक्ति ने ताला लगा दिया और उसको कहा ये तुम्हारा घर नहीं है, जाओ। उसके 3 छोटे छोटे बच्चे, और उन बच्चों को लेके वो गांव में घूमे और गांव के लोगों की गौशाला में अपने बच्चों को लेके रातें बिताए, दिन में उनके खेतों में काम करे। ऐसा बहुत लंबा समय नहीं हुआ, हमको पता चल गया, और किसी दूसरे काम से मैं केशव को मिलने गई उनके ऑफिस में। उन्होंने कहा और सब ठीक है? हाँ सब ठीक है। फिर मैंने एकदम, मेरे मन में एकदम आया और मैंने उस महिला की कहानी उनको बता दी। उनको कहा कि वो किस तरह से परेशान है। उन्होंने कहा उसको घर मिलना चाहिए। मैंने कहा हाँ जरूर मिलना चाहिए। केशव आप कर सकते हैं क्या? जरूर कर सकता हूँ, आप मुझे बुलाइए ना उस इलाके में। मैंने कहा बिल्कुल अभी आइए। 2 दिन बाद हमारा एक बाल मेला है, हम बच्चों के लिए काम करते हैं, तो उसमें आप आइए, हम आपको अपने बाल मेले का चीफ गेस्ट बना करके ले जाएंगे, और आप थोड़ा उसका वो भी कर दीजिए। तो उन्होंने कहा हाँ मैं जरूर आऊंगा, पर ये बाल मेला का गेस्ट वगैरह ये छोड़ो, ये मुझे कुछ नहीं करना है, मुझे वो महिला को देखना है, उसको मिलना है। तो तीसरे दिन केशव वॉज देयर। एक साधारण शर्ट और पैंट पहन के वो उस जगह पहुंचे, और पहुंच के हमसे बोले कहाँ है वो महिला? हमने कहा अभी थोड़ा धैर्य रखिए, आपको हमने चीफ गेस्ट बनाया है, आप मेहरबानी करके थोड़ी देर बैठिए हमारी सभा में, बच्चों के प्रोग्राम देखिए। लेकिन हर 5 मिनट, 10 मिनट, 15 मिनट बाद केशव कहेंगे, राधा बहन वो महिला कहाँ है? मैंने कहा हाँ मिलेंगे मिलेंगे, अभी मिलेंगे। और फिर सभा खत्म हो गई। मैंने उस महिला को पहले ही कहा था कि आपको रुके रहना है, आप यहाँ पीछे की ओर बैठ जाइए, यहीं बैठे रहिए। तो मैं उनको, केशव को मिलाने ले गई। बिल्कुल ऐसे उस महिला से मिले, इतने प्यार से उसे बात की। वो महिला बाद में भी कहती थी, मैंने सोचा मेरा भाई आ गया। और उनको कहा आपको घबराने की जरूरत नहीं, मैं कल को आपका घर दिलवाऊंगा। वो बहुत आश्वस्त हो गई। कोई डीएम ये सब नहीं करता है। कोई डीएम 50-100 किलोमीटर दूर एक महिला का घर दिलाने नहीं जाता है। लेकिन केशव तो केशव। तो बस उन्होंने नाम पूछ लिया, जिन्होंने उनके घर को ताला लगा दिया था उनका नाम भी पूछ लिया। और फिर उनके पटवारी पेशकार तो वहां थे ही, क्योंकि डीएम आया था तो उनको रहना था। और वो आए, उनको कहा, बहुत शांति से कहा, मैं बराबर उनके साथ थी, केशव के साथ। तो वह शांति से कहा, देखो कल को उस महिला का घर उसको दिला देना है, आप जाइए कल वहां। कोई ऑर्डर नहीं था, वो एक सलाह की तरह कहा। मैं सोचती हूँ कोई रौब नहीं दिखा रहा है, लेकिन कौन सी ताकत है जो काम करती है। दूसरे दिन पेशकार वहां पहुंचे और उन्होंने कहा ये किसने ताला लगाया? उसने तो जरा रौब से ही कहा होगा और उसका ताला खुलवा दिया और महिला से कहा ये तुम्हारा घर, इसके अंदर रहो, ये तुमको बिल्कुल तंग नहीं करेंगे, मैं डीएम के आदेश से आया हूँ। तो पूरा उसको कह के आया। और उस महिला ने कहा, मुझे मेरा पुराना घर नहीं मिला, मुझे हमारे डीएम ने नया घर बना के दे दिया। उसको इतना अच्छा लगा। और मुझे लगता है कि उसको जो प्यार मिला था और उनके अधिकारी जो काम करते थे, हमने कहा आपने तो बहुत जल्दी एक्शन लिया, एकदम दूसरे दिन चले गए। हम विश्वास नहीं करते थे कि ये सरकारी अधिकारी इतनी जल्दी कर देंगे। लेकिन उनको हमने कहा आपने बहुत जल्दी किया। उन्होंने कहा ये डीएम दूसरा है ना, ही इज समथिंग एल्स। ये उसने कहा ये कुछ और है। तो वो और था केशव, जिसको सही में पब्लिक सर्वेंट कहते हैं, लोगों का सेवक कहते हैं, वो उनके अंदर था। वो एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर नहीं था, लेकिन उनकी जो पब्लिक सर्विस थी वो इतनी कामदार थी, इतना काम उससे होता था कि वो किसी तरह का धमकी या किसी तरह का रौब या कुछ दिखाने की जरूरत नहीं थी। उनकी मुस्कुराहट उनके चेहरे पर रहती थी। और ये जरूर है कि उन्होंने एक बार कहा पेशकार को और फिर गाड़ी में बैठते समय दूसरी बार कहा, आप जरूर ध्यान रखिए और कल जाइए। और कल जाइए माने कल जाइए, ये उस आदमी को एहसास हो गया केशव के बोलने से। तो मुझे लगता है ये बहुत बड़ा उदाहरण है। हमारे बहुत हैं, आईएएस हैं, जिलाधिकारी हैं, दूसरे अधिकारी हैं, वे अपने को एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर ही ज्यादा मानते हैं। पब्लिक सर्वेंट कितने लोग मानते हैं और कुछ होंगे, कुछ तो करते ही होंगे, लेकिन केशव ने उत्तराखंड के लोगों को ये सबसे बड़ी चीज दी, ये चीज दी जो वो जीवन भर करेंगे, सोचेंगे, उसको उस पर काम करेंगे, उस पर अपना अभ्यास करेंगे, तो उनको लगेगा कि ये ज्यादा कारगर चीज है, ये स्नेह दिखाना, ये निकटता दिखाना, ये लोगों को लगे कि ये मेरा आदमी है, ये मेरा साथी है। और इससे जो काम हो जाता है वो बहुत बड़ा काम होता है। ऐसा ही एक काम एक दूसरी बार भी उन्होंने किया था। अभी मेरे ख्याल से राम भाई ने जिक्र किया कि वो एक समय उत्तराखंड के स्वास्थ्य विभाग के अधिकारी थे। एक बस का एक्सीडेंट हो गया और उसमें कुछ तो लगा कि मर गए हैं, लेकिन कुछ थे जो बहुत बुरी तरह घायल हो गए थे, और उन लोगों को भी एक मतलब तुरंत ट्रीटमेंट चाहिए था, तुरंत इलाज चाहिए था। अगर जल्दी इलाज नहीं होगा तो वो भी खत्म हो सकते हैं, मर सकते हैं, ऐसा था। तो उस समय में वहां एक कोई हमारे पहचान के थे जो थोड़ा समाज में सेवा का काम भी करते थे। उन्होंने मुझे फोन किया और कहा कि अभी बताइए कैसे इनको हल्द्वानी में तुरंत ट्रीटमेंट मिले। हम किसी भी अस्पताल में जाएंगे, पहले होगा कि डॉक्टर नहीं है, फिर होगा कि डॉक्टर आ गए हैं, अब तैयारी हो रही है, अब ये हो रहा है, अब वो हो रहा है, और तब तक तो ये लोग दम तोड़ देंगे। लेकिन मैंने कहा नहीं, तुम धैर्य रखो, तुम ले जाओ इनको, हल्द्वानी ले जाओ और तुम वहां के अस्पताल में तुरंत इनको भर्ती कराने की कोशिश करो। मैंने केशव को फोन किया। केशव ने तुरंत वहां के डॉक्टर्स को और वहां के एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन को या जो भी लोग थे संबंधित, सबको फोन करके कहा कि जो ये अभी घायल लोग आ रहे हैं, एक भी नहीं मरना चाहिए, सबको ठीक ट्रीटमेंट दो, सब अभी तैयारी कर दो, वो पहुंचने वाले हैं। जैसे कोई अपने लोगों के लिए कहता है वैसे उन्होंने कहा। और जैसे ही वो जो समाज सेवक था वो मुझे कहता था, दीदी वहां मैं गया तो डॉक्टर्स बिल्कुल ऐसे खड़े थे, हर चीज उनके पास थी, हर दवा थी, हर ड्रेसिंग सामान था, हर तैयार की थी, बेड तैयार किए थे, और वो लोग खुद अपने बिल्कुल तैनात खड़े थे। और जैसे ही ये लोग गए, उनको बेड में रखा, तुरंत इलाज शुरू हुआ, तुरंत दवाएं दी गई जिससे कि उनका तकलीफ कुछ कम हो जाए, तुरंत और घावों को ठीक किया गया। सब काम करके एक भी नहीं मरा, सब ठीक हो गए। और ये किस लिए, कैसे हो गया? क्योंकि ये केशव की प्रायोरिटी थी। पीपल, लोग, सामान्य लोग, उस बस में सामान्य गांव के लोग थे, कोई वीआईपी नहीं था। उन सामान्य लोगों के लिए इतना सब करवाना, मैं मानती हूँ कि उनके प्रति जो सही प्रेम है मन के अंदर, वही एक कारण था। तो इसलिए मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि उत्तराखंड के लोग और खास करके हम जैसे लोग जो इस सब बात को समझते हैं, हम कभी केशव को भूल नहीं सकते। हमारे बहुत लोग, अच्छे लोग आए हैं, कई बार अच्छे लोग आए हैं, कई बार सामान्य लोग आए हैं, हमारे साथ सब लोगों का थोड़ा अच्छा व्यवहार तो रहा है, पर जो केशव का तरीका था वो तरीका सब में तो नहीं था। और मैं मानती हूँ कि सचमुच में एक पब्लिक सर्वेंट को या तो एक पब्लिक सर्विस वाले व्यक्ति को क्या करना चाहिए, कैसा रहना चाहिए, कैसे काम करना चाहिए, कौन सी स्पिरिट अंदर से होनी चाहिए, उसको बहुत अच्छी तरह हमको या हमारे लोगों को, हमारे अधिकारियों को उन्होंने सिखाया और हमारे लोगों को भी सिखाया कि हमको कैसे उनकी सेवा को ले लेना चाहिए, कैसे वो हमको अपना लाभ दे सकते हैं, उसको हमें भी समझना चाहिए। तो इसलिए मुझे लगता है मैं बहुत कहूंगी नहीं, कुल मिलाकर मैं उसी केवल पक्ष को कहना चाहती हूँ कि वो पीपल के व्यक्ति थे, लोगों के व्यक्ति थे और उन्होंने उत्तराखंड में तो लोगों के लिए ही काम किया और जो बाद में कुछ नीतियां भी बनाई, कुछ पॉलिसीज भी बनाई, वो भी लोगों के हित में। या जब वो स्वास्थ्य विभाग में थे तो कुछ नई चीजें शुरू की, कुछ एक नई बस चलवाई, एक कुछ और दूसरे काम किए, वो सब ऐसे थे जिससे लोग ज्यादा सुविधा से सेवाएं पा सकें, स्वास्थ्य की सेवाएं पा सकें, ऐसा काम उन्होंने किया था। तो इसलिए मैं इतनी बात कह के आप सबको बहुत धन्यवाद देती हूँ और राम भाई को विशेष धन्यवाद देती हूँ कि उन्होंने मुझे इसके लिए बुलाया भी और फिर मुझे इस बात की भी इजाजत दी कि आप हिंदी बोलिए, हिंदी में बात कीजिए। तो बहुत धन्यवाद राम भाई और आप सब लोगों को भी, सुनने वालों को भी नमस्कार और प्रणाम।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद राधा बहन। जैसे आपने कहा कि केशव ने उत्तराखंड के लोगों को प्यार दिया, लेकिन उत्तराखंड ने भी उनको अपनाया कि अपना होगा। तो इट वाज अ म्यूचुअल रिलेशनशिप ऑफ लव, अफेक्शन, रिगार्ड एंड सर्विस। थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर योर वंडरफुल मेमोरीज। Our next speaker is also based in Uttarakhand, in Dehradun. Jo Chopra Magavan lives in Dehradun, where she works as the executive director of the Latika Royal Foundation, a non-profit for disabled children. She's written apart from her professional work, she's also a writer. She's written in Newsweek, Guardian, EPW, the Indian Express, where she published a wonderfully moving tribute to Keshav shortly after he died. But the line in her biodata I like best is, she is a former criminal jailed many times as a peace activist in the United States. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much. It is really an honor to be here today in such an illustrious group of Keshav's friends and to get a chance to remember him one more time. I do love these opportunities. I'm going to talk about his work in disability, and I'm going to do it a little bit roundabout by first talking about disability in India and the situation that we find ourselves in. I've been in the field for over 30 years, and one of the things that we get used to working in disability is hearing a lot of platitudes. We hear comparisons to us and Mother Teresa. We're told that we're doing God's work, and it's really irritating, and we argue with it sometimes, but most of the time we just brush it off and roll with it because people don't listen. But I think about people who are disabled hearing those same platitudes, hearing the people who work with them, their teachers, their therapists, regarded in that way as being saintly and doing God's work because they're working with them. And I really wonder what that feels like for them. When you're disabled, you are ignored, you are avoided, you're patronized, you're labeled. And one of the things that I personally find most repellent is that you're deified. You are made into something so much higher than normal human beings. And the most obvious example of this is the term that the Prime Minister has come up with of Divyang. And I absolutely hate this term. It's absurd, and it's also completely sentimental. Oscar Wilde once said that a sentimentalist is one who desires the luxury of an emotion without having to pay for it. And I know that Mr. Modi could not have asked a single disabled person whether this was a term that they wanted to be referred by, whether they wanted to be the incarnation of the divine. And I'm pretty sure he didn't ask anybody because he was afraid of what they might say, because 75% of Divyang children are out of school. 65% of Divyang adults are unemployed. So Mr. Modi doesn't want to invest the time or the money into education or jobs so that disabled people can just be normal citizens like anybody else. He'd rather call them divine and put them on a pedestal where they really don't want to be. My disabled friends don't want to be deified. Disability is one part of their personality, one part of their lives, but it's not the only part, and it's not even the most important part. All they really want are their constitutional rights, the same rights as any other citizen of India. And so it was such a breath of fresh air to meet someone like Keshav Desiraju, who literally did not notice disability. And I don't mean that he didn't notice it. He did, of course. Anybody can see if somebody's blind or somebody is deaf or can't walk. But because in everything that he did, he had trained himself to focus on what really mattered, on the important thing that was in front of him. And I remember this happening with me all the time. I have a tendency to ramble, and especially when I would meet someone like him, I would be so overawed that I would forget what I wanted to say, and I would go about all these circuitous things. And he would say, Joe, get to the point. What is it that you want to say? What is the important thing you want to get across, that you want to achieve right now? And that is how he looked at disability. It was there, but it wasn't that important. It wasn't a thing any more than caste or religion or language was. Keshav was a deeply gracious and courteous person. And the hallmark of graciousness is that you remove the superficials and you get to the heart of the matter, the most important thing, which is the person who's sitting in front of you. And when Keshav thought about people, he thought about rights. So when I went to him and told him about disabled children or children who were at risk of developing a disability, and I said that what they really need is early intervention. What they need is a chance. They need a level playing field. And what Keshav saw was that that was their right. And so making that happen by giving us the funding to open the Gubara Center at the Doon Hospital, the early intervention program that the Latika Roy Foundation ran there, was to him not nothing special for disabled children. It was just what disabled children needed. And in the same way that other children might need something else, and that should be provided by the government, this was something that disabled kids needed. He made sure we got that funding, and then he shepherded us for the next 10 years in working with the government. That is a minefield, and anybody who's worked in the government knows it's very difficult, and you need a lot of support from an advocate like Keshav. And of course, it wasn't just us that he was doing that for. He was doing it for the Latika Roy Foundation, but he was also doing it on a national level in the eradication of polio campaign, which he managed brilliantly, saving generations of children from the disability that polio would have brought them, or being the patron of an organization like Vidyasagar, which just last night I got their annual report. Poonam sent it to me, and there on the inside front cover is a picture of Keshav and his message to the Vidyasagar family. He worked tirelessly for the disabled, both systemically and personally. But for me, the real magic about Keshav was this refusal to be sentimental about disability. And I can't stress this enough. Sentimentality is the default mode around the world and particularly here in India. James Baldwin said that sentimentality is the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion. And he said it's the mark of dishonesty, of an inability to feel, even by pretending to feel so much. And he said it's the mask of cruelty. And I want you to just look around at the way that disabled people are treated in India, the cruelty with which disabled children are excluded from school, the cruelty with which disabled adults are refused the right to a job. They are excluded at every possible forum in this country. And yet they are called Divyang by the government. They are said to be walking around with the hand of God on their head, and they are the divine representation in our midst. And this is how we treat them. I am the mother of a disabled woman, and for over 30 years I've worked in this field, and I can tell you how rare Keshav's understanding of disability was. He refused to treat disabled people any differently than anyone else. He refused to see them as special, as gifted, as divine. He gave them what they really want, which is respect and rights. He treated them as human beings, no better and no worse than anybody else. Since his death, I have been trying, 5 weeks now, trying to understand what it was that made him unique. And I finally have come to it that it's this, that he spent his life fighting for the rights of the disabled, mentally ill, the poor. But it wasn't because they were disabled or mentally ill or poor. It was because they were being denied their rights. It's a subtle difference, and it takes a capacious mind like Keshav's to navigate that difference. But I think if we can try and understand it, we will be living his legacy and remembering who he was and what he did for this country, and in my field, particularly for the disabled. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. As Joe said, she briefly alluded to Keshav's work on mental health, which was so very much in consonance with his work for people with children with special needs, and of course his deep interest in the rights of the dispossessed and the disadvantaged. And our next speaker is a distinguished mental health professional, Professor Sanjeev Jain of NIMHANS, doctor, scholar, teacher, researcher, and if I may say, on the basis of 30 years personal experience, exemplary in all respects. I'm very happy that Sanjeev is here today to talk about Keshav's work in the area of mental health. And again, it's a sign of the extraordinary relationships that Keshav built and nurtured, which were between people who knew each other but did not know that other person's connection with Keshav. I mean, I've known Sanjeev for 30 years, which is as long as I've known Keshav and known him pretty well too. But, it's, I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure others too, because I never knew that two of my good friends had this serious professional relationship, which, among other things, greatly helped the field of mental health and also the premier institution in the field located in our hometown, Bangalore. Sanjeev.
Thank you, Ram, and it's a pleasure to be here for very different times, remembering a colleague and somebody we worked with intensively about 10 years ago, drafting the mental health policy, because Mr. Keshav Desiraju chaired and convened the committee that was to draft the mental health policy, which was finally released in 2014. And I was part of that committee on behalf of NIMHANS and also as a psychiatrist. The whole process was intended as a root and branch reform of the whole nature of mental health care, from its legal provisioning to assuring its delivery. It was a very motley group with psychiatrists, anti-psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, bureaucrats, with a very set of very divergent opinions and attitudes about psychiatry itself. And it required fairly deft balancing on Keshav's part, ensuring representation from as wide a spectrum of professional and scientific opinion and personal. His interaction with patients and families has already been alluded to, and he would make it a point to talk to patients and families and get their opinions, and still keeping the overall aims in mind of what mental health reform needed. And these broad aims were quite explicit in his mind. One was to place mental illness on the same platform as the other non-communicable diseases, which he had been advocating and emphasizing. And he went to the World Health Organization and insisted that mental illness be put on the same platform as hypertension, diabetes, asthma, etc. Somehow integrate the care of the mentally ill into general health care and nudge the system to ensure that access to healthcare was seen as a fundamental right of the citizen and a basic duty of the state and society. This has never been stated so vehemently before, as has already been alluded to. And by this, he showed that the steel frame of the bureaucracy that India is so fond of advertising was flexible enough to try to transform the horrible inertia of healthcare, with the huge behemoth of healthcare, of which is essentially an immovable object, to something that would interact dynamically with all segments of society and all the stakeholders and achieve something that was more meaningful in its contemporary roles. And all this was done, I must say, with the irresistible force that Mr. Desiraju could muster, which is quite substantial in any case, always with abundant charm, a twinkle in his eyes, a mischievous smile, and the capacity to diffuse any contentious issue with a slight turn of phrase and smoothen the committee efforts to arrive at a consensus. He was, of course, also quite aware of the shortcomings, and he was skeptical of the system. At one time confessing that when he discussed the financial implications of this improved healthcare system, mental health care, his colleague in the finance ministry asked him with some incredulity, "So do you want me to plan for the financial support of a group of people who will never actually financially contribute to the country?" And he was quite amazed that this idea could persist in branches of the government. It was so foreign to his way of seeing the world that, he was quite incredulous. So he was therefore acutely aware of the difficult task of combining his rosy vision of the realpolitik pragmatism of ministerial maneuvering and professional jealousies and chip on the shoulder attitudes amongst the medical profession. So he had, of course, taken care to acquaint himself with as many of the complex issues in psychiatry as possible, from visiting mentally ill people in shelters and their homes, talking to their families, visiting institutions, interacting with the faculty at NIMHANS. As Ram mentioned, he was instrumental in helping it being designated as a INI, Institute of National Importance, whatever that may mean. And other centers at AIIMS and Ranchi and the health services in the length and breadth of the country. We held meetings in far-flung districts from Punjab to Bihar to Jharkhand to Assam, and of course in southern India. He was also deeply interested in the history of psychiatry in itself and how the idea of the psyche and the asylum and the mental hospital had evolved in Europe, transferred to India under colonial rule. But how certain attitudes and systems which were evolved during the colonial rule had persisted through sheer inertia, stigma, and unconcern, and this had held back or even prevented reform in psychiatric services. He was quite aware of this. And reforming the law was thus of immediate concern to him. And he was instrumental in drafting this, making it compatible with various international treaties and standards that India had already signed on to, like the UNCRPD. This is no simple exercise, as all over the world, the models of medical care and intervention and those of social welfare and inclusion are fraught with tension. They have sometimes almost antagonistic attitudes toward each other, and he was able to negotiate this to work towards a greater goal of trying to ensure that people with illness were simply treated as people and not as labels of illness. The Mental Health Care Act of 2017 will thus live on as a signal contribution with its insistence on access to mental health services as a fundamental right and efforts to provide this at every level that would need to be made as a part of policy itself. And the policy itself, he made sure, now covered a much wider spectrum. Instead of the usual preoccupation with the dangerousness of the lunatics and how to lock them up, from the needs of children in reform schools, the needs of parents who are looking after the mentally ill children, the needs of these adult children when their parents will no longer be there, and therefore providing a much wider spectrum of the kind of services that mental illness or mental health care requires. So this kind of preoccupation, looking at the much wider perspective of psychiatry rather than just a segment of, how to address the social aspects of this, was quite evident. So he was able to concern himself with issues from chronic illness to depression, to suicide, to medical care, to social outcomes, and try to fit all this into a policy which we hope would serve the needs of at least the next few decades. This is not all as somber and serious as it seems to be. In between these meetings, he would find time to tell us about his love for classical music. He would tell us about his favorite commentators and critics of various kinds of people who liked music and what a deep impact it had on him. His deep engagement with political history, including some of the persons involved. And of course, all the books that he was enjoying, from history to literature to short stories. One of the spin-offs of all this engagement was an encouragement to attempt a history of psychiatry and mental health care in southern India and its links to the present, because he, with his connection and his deep understanding of the governance and the archives, he was able to tell us where all these archives are stored. And we've been very lucky with his nudging. We've been able to get documents of mental illness, of looking after mental illness from the late 18th century, stuck in the archives of Travancore and Chennai. We worked on this policy document in the Mental Health Care Act almost a decade ago, and remained in touch over the next decade. And we even invested him in his new office, to which he had been transferred when he was moved out of the Ministry of Health. But it all seems quite recent, because at every time he met you as somebody who was deeply engaged with the kind of work that we were doing. I mean, I work in a big, which is now the National Institute of Mental Health, but is basically a huge mental hospital with 500 patients. And he would still be concerned about what were we doing about the needs and the rights and the lives of the mentally ill. And his commitment and enthusiasm to do something for these marginalized people of section of society, and was very, very infectious, because as the others have pointed out, it was with the degree of commitment he had to ensure that people with mental illness were treated with dignity and respect, rather than as a burden on the state, which the World Bank encourages us to do, that the global burden of disease is the prevailing mantra. He never used that word of global burden. These were people who needed help, who needed a helping hand, and I only wish he had been around for much longer to see how these changes that he tried to put into the framework of the policy actually begin to make changes to those with mental illness. It will take time, budgets being budgets and the government being the government, but the policy and the impulse that he has transmitted to this whole field of mental health care will, I am sure, lead to much better services in the near future. I really miss him, because I think it's a man must see the outcome of his labors. And he had persisted for so long and so insistently about this, that I wish he had been around to see the actual changes that he's making to services. And that's all I can say at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Akshay talked about the fact that there was no sense of hierarchy in his Keshav's dealings with ordinary people, unlike IAS officers. That, of course, was one very distinctive aspect of his personality, which marked him out, as both Radhaben and you said, from other kinds of civil servants. Joe talked about his deep sense of compassion. But listening to Sanjeev and, of course, knowing other aspects of Keshav's work, there's another aspect of what made him so special, was that he had a deep respect for science and scholarship. The typical IAS officer, if a professor from NIMHANS or even the director of NIMHANS was to walk into his office and ask for an appointment to join Secretary of Health, he will say, this guy's pay grade is that of a deputy secretary, so he can be half an hour before he comes and sees me. That's kind of how most IAS officers were. But Keshav, partly because it was innate, partly because he was the nephew and grandson of distinguished scholars, just had, so both intellectually respect for fine minds, original researchers, and empathy for the armed army and the armed robber. At all levels, there was this very, very unusual side to him. So it's appropriate that Soumya follows Sanjeev because she is also a distinguished scientist who worked very closely with Keshav. Soumya is a globally recognized researcher on tuberculosis and HIV. She was, for several years, the distinguished Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research before being appointed as Deputy Director General of the WHO, where she is now Chief Scientist. Many of you would have seen her, particularly during the pandemic, when the WHO has, of course, played a very important and crucial role. She's an elected foreign fellow of the US National Academy of Medicine, and wrote a very nice piece on Keshav in the Times of India shortly after he died, which was about really his contributions to public policy. Soumya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ram, and I apologize. I'm outside with not very good internet connection. But, I've been listening to all the previous speakers. It's been so moving. And it's also described Keshav so well that I have very little left, to say, especially hearing from Radha Ben. One can just, if you know Keshav, you knew that he would be like that. The fact remains, I think, that people continue to be astonished that you can have a human being with so many qualities of empathy, of compassion, but also of being a very efficient administrator. And somebody like that existing in our system and lasting through in our system, despite all the challenges that system throws at you, and quietly making these remarkable changes without any fuss, but at the same time, things that really lead to transformation in the status quo. So there's really very little left for me to say, except that, as Ram just mentioned, I think his recognition and belief in science and data and evidence, I think was, to me, exemplified by his setting up of the NTAGI, which is a National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, prior to which there was a rather ad hoc system within the health ministry of deciding which vaccines would be introduced into the national program and how it would be done and so on. And it was a mishmash of ad hoc experts coming together. Unfortunately, the system is still like that in many other aspects of decision making. This, I think, is a model, the way he set up an expert advisory group. There were criteria of who would be on that group. It was co-chaired by 3 secretaries, health research, and biotechnology, because that's bringing all of the science together. There was a separate group that was set up, initially housed at the Public Health Foundation of India, later on moved to within the ministry, that did all of the background work of collecting the evidence behind a particular new vaccine that was to be introduced, doing all of the analytics and presenting to this group. I remember at one point we were being attacked when I obviously co-chaired that group for some time when I was Secretary Health Research, and it is indeed a deep regret that I never got to work with Keshav as a peer, and I was never in Delhi at the same time that he was. I think we could have done so much together, but nevertheless, he set up the systems which then enabled people like me and others who come afterwards to contribute in a meaningful manner. And we were being at one time attacked and targeted for introducing HPV vaccine. A lot of right-wing groups saying that this was breeding promiscuity. One group was saying that, the other group was saying, well, they've all sold out to companies and just want to push vaccines on the public. Not very different from what's going on now in many countries, not just in India. And I remember saying to one of the journalists, do you think that a committee that's chaired by 3 secretaries, that you think it's possible for a private company to buy up, a company like that, or to make it conflicted? So that's the thing about him, is that he was so thoughtful that he set up these systems in a way that was so robust that it would be difficult to challenge. And of course, he also, the other thing I pointed out in my article is that he was very inclusive and he brought the critics on board, because he always felt better to have critics in your house, under your roof, rather than, outside. So we always, we had people that had strong views that disagreed and that also expressed their views outside the committee. But this system that he set up has lasted all of these years. I think it's been about 10 years now, and it's only gone from strength to strength. And I think everybody accepts now that, India's immunization program to a large extent is driven by science, data, and evidence. And I think he used this in the National Health Mission as well, the approach of being inclusive, of really looking at what is the program meant to serve, what is the health ministry's role really, and who are you serving? And this is, I think, what other speakers have said about, in his mind, he always had that person who was not being reached, that person who was being excluded, and thinking about how do we change the system? How do we make it more inclusive? And I found that this is not a common thing, because I have worked with, bureaucrats across many different ministries and different states. And you do have other bureaucrats who also have this open and broad vision, but it's not the routine. It should be. It should be, because that's what governments and bureaucracy are there to do. So this is why I think there's been this outpouring of appreciation, and I hope that serves as inspiration for younger officers, to emulate Keshav. The thing is, he was so modest and humble. He must be smiling now, and maybe even annoyed that we are all singing his praises. But I think it's also heartfelt and so genuine. Nobody's making up stories about him. He was just Keshav, and I think it's good to share, all of these experiences, because not only does it help us, I mean, we are still heartbroken at the fact that he left us. There was so much work to be done. He was still contributing quietly, in so many ways. We're still finding out all the things he was doing, apart from writing his books and following his passion and, his unfinished book on Tyagaraja, for example. But it not only helps the healing, but, it helps to reaffirm our faith, that there are good people out there, and they will always be. And so we need to continue to believe in that. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you, Soumya. As Soumya said, Keshav died relatively early. He was only 66. He did not die of COVID. He left too early. He had unfinished work. But in some ways, he lives on in everyone in this panel, and in everyone he touched, he inspired, he moved, he collaborated with, and which is why it's been, for me, as everyone else, such a moving, enriching, educative, illuminating, and consolatory experience listening to all of you. So I'm now going to end with Samant, Samant Subramanian, who's and those who know me know I'm not shy of sweeping statements. The preeminent non-fiction writer of his generation, who's written 3 wonderful books on 3 very different topics. The first, Following Fish, which Keisha, being a pure vegetarian, may have put up his nose and not thought of smelling what's going on and read. I know he liked your other 2 books very much, the one on the Sri Lankan Civil War, and of course your more recent biography of J.B.S. Ordain. But Samant is going to speak about, we've heard about Keshav the public servant, Keshav the specialist in health policy, Keshav the adopted native Uttarakhand. Samant is going to speak about Keshav's deep and abiding love for music. And before I hand over the mic to him, let me say that I myself, unlike Samant, who has a properly trained ear and has written some very insightful essays on music himself, I am an enthusiastic amateur listener of our classical music. And for 30 years, Keshav instructed me on Hindustani music, which was not his specialty, with care, love, affection, and never patronizingly. And I miss him in many respects, and in music education most of all. Yesterday, I was listening to Malini Rajurkar, who's a magnificent vocalist, relatively underrated, whom I know Keshav admired. And there was a composition in Hamir. And normally I would have called Keshav and he would have told me something about the singer, something about the gharaya, something about the training, and something about the rag, which would have, just made me a less ignorant person about our classical music. So Sabat is going to speak about music, which was an interest of Keshav very early on, which antedated his career as a civil servant, which continued through his career as a civil servant. In fact, he once even almost left the civil service to take up a job as music curator of a classical collection at Harvard. And of course, post-dated his career as a civil servant when, in retirement in Chennai, he wrote a magnificent biography of M.S. Subbulakshmi. Samat.
Thank you, Ram. As Ram said, I've been asked today to speak about Keshav's relationship with music, which I consider a great privilege because Keshav loved his music so much that he seemed to live for it. So to talk about Keshav and music is to talk about his life force itself, the thing that occupied his mind more hours of the day than anything else. As many of you here will know, it was Carnatic music in particular that filled his heart. You will also doubtless have read his biography of M.S. Subbulakshmi called Of Gifted Voice, which was published earlier this year. But there was something in the way Keshav related to this music that was very eloquent, that said so much about the kind of person he was, and even about the kind of person we could all hope to be. I was first introduced to Keshav back in 2012, when we both lived in Delhi, by a couple of friends who knew of our shared interest in Carnatic music. I have a feeling Ram actually was one of them. For a couple of years, I've been writing a short column on music in a weekend paper, and Keshav had read some of these pieces and he had asked for an introduction. In itself, this is remarkable. He was still working in the civil service. He had a full and active life. He had friends all over the city. He didn't particularly have to make the effort to meet new people, but he did. Moreover, there was no question that his knowledge and appreciation of music was vastly superior to anything I or my brief columns could claim. I mean, introducing us must have felt to Ram like introducing Gundappa Vishwanath to a 4th division cricketer. But it didn't matter to Keshav. To share an enthusiasm was the most important thing. It revealed his sense of egalitarianism and his disregard for disparities in age or experience. I've never met anyone else who has forged genuine, equal friendships with so many people so much younger than him. To sit next to Keshav at a concert was a terrific experience. I mean, he wasn't one of those constant talkers, thank heavens. And if he hummed, it was only very occasionally and very quietly. But he had a very mobile face and he'd use it to turn to you in silent communication. So there would be the raised eyebrows and puzzlement if you heard a phrase that was off or a song that was unexpected. The rolled eyes, if a singer started pandering, he rolled those eyes so often. The pursed lip nod of appreciation when he heard something he admired. He knew what he liked, what he didn't like, but this never made him dogmatic. He was open to being surprised or to being unexpectedly pleased. And this is even more extraordinary when you consider just how much he knew about music. I mean, this was a man who recalled song lists from concerts in the 1960s, a man who, out of his own interest, meticulously created an index for the music magazine Shruti. In the lecture demonstrations that marked the mornings of the music season schedule every December in Madras, it was invariably the case that he knew nearly as much or more than the person delivering the lecture. Once I remember we had attended a talk by a very well-respected violinist about a set of songs by Muthuswami Dikshitar, the composer. Keshav went right home after the talk and he emailed me a journal article he'd read and digested years earlier on aspects of these songs that the violinist had not talked about at all. But the thing was that this depth of knowledge never interfered with his capacity for delight, which if you think about it is a very unusual thing. And part of the reason for that, I think, was that while he seriously loved his music, he never took it seriously, in the sense that there were no holy cows, there were no ineffable sanctities. He recognized music as a human enterprise, as something that could be inspiring on one day and could be comical on the next, just as human beings are. And so my absolute fondest memories of sitting next to Keshav in concerts have to do with the occasions when he did lean over to say something, not to share information, but to remind me of an inside joke or to make a gossipy remark. And then we would both just dissolve into fits of giggles, shaking silently next to each other, just to, while other people stared at us. One day he called me. We were in different countries at this point, but he was researching his MS Subbulakshmi book. So one day he called me, falling all over himself with laughter, just to say that he'd found out a fact that verged on the absurd, which is that the two young great-granddaughters of MS Subbulakshmi, who often perform together today, they always do so with a painted effigy of MS backstage. They take this effigy, this statue, along to every concert, everywhere they perform. And he found this hilarious, and he called me just to communicate this. And then a little while later, he found a photo of this effigy, and he sent that along as well. And that photo became a trope for us, a literal idolization of the kind that Keshav never subscribed to, and that he thought was positively injurious to the appreciation of art. If Keshav had idolized MS, his book would not have been half as good as it is. The thing that made the book was that he was able to regard MS with both fondness and clarity. So MS's concerts over the years formed the spine of his life, and it would have been easy for him to drown the book in nostalgia. As he was writing the book, and as we discussed the things that he was finding, he would often say, in fact, that the first responsibility of his was to avoid that temptation to be sentimental. And the book shows just how much he succeeded in that, how warm he is towards MS, but he's aware of her failures or her missteps. Here's an example. One of the most popular criticisms of MS was that many of her concerts sounded the same, that they were made up of the same small subset of a small number of songs and ragams, that she sang these with little variation. Even the alapanas, which are the essays of the ragam, which are theoretically composed on the spot, even those could feel predictable. And anyone else who loved MS's music as much as Keshav did might have felt defensive about this. But Keshav acknowledged it, explained it, and looked beyond it as he saw it all as part of a greater picture, which didn't stop him, of course, from sending me emails every time he found an MS rendition of a song he had never heard her sing. His excitement, you could feel his excitement over email. It was as if he had discovered a lost Picasso. I consider it such an honor to speak about this side of Keshav, in part because I think it offers us all some secrets on how to live. I've been reading a new book by Rebecca Solnit. It's called Orwell's Roses, in which she writes about George Orwell's politics, but also about his love of gardening and nature. It's easy to think about liberals as dour scolds, she writes. It's easy to think, in fact, that if we are politically engaged in facing up to the world's problems, we shouldn't really have time for roses or music or literature. But Orwell's love of nature, like Keshav's love of music, complicates that easy stereotype, and it raises different kinds of questions. They were questions, and here I quote Solnit to end, they were questions about who he was and who we were, and where pleasure and beauty and hours with no quantifiable practical result fit into the life of someone, perhaps of anyone, who also cared about justice and truth and human rights and how to change the world. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Samant. That was a perfect ending to this evening. I'd like to thank the Bangalore International Centre for hosting this event. Keshav had deep connections with this city. I spoke about his family coming from Mysore, where his grandfather established a well-known engineering college, where possibly some of his love of music came from. His three siblings live in Bangalore, so that's another connection he had with the city. For those of you who want to follow more of Keshav's work, there are his two books, Of Gifted Voice on MS Subbulakshmi, And Healers or Predators, ? Edited with Samira Nandi and Sanjay Nagral on healthcare corruption in India. There's also a video recording on YouTube of the discussion he had with Vishnu Vasudev on his MS book, which I urge you to listen. So thank you all for being here. Good night, and particularly my deepest gratitude to all the panelists who have given very rich, complementary perspectives on what an extraordinary human being, public servant, and scholar Keshav Desiraju was. Thank you.